at the 7 o'clock hour. We'll start our workshop portion of our meeting from 7 until 7:30, and then at 7:30 we'll start with our regular agenda. And with that, Natalie has very kindly offered to share with us some thinking by the city around potential zoning around new affordable housing.
Yeah,
right?
zoning for affordable housing. Let me see, it should be up there.
There it is.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this was a presentation that I went over with the council at their last workshop meeting, just talking about, and it's not new content for them. I think this has been shared previously by the previous planner, John Clark, in terms of tools that can be used to incentivize the development of all housing in your community, which the argument is then has effects on affordable housing, as well as tools directly for affordable housing. So before jumping into the tools, I kind of wanted to give a bit of like regional background data information. And I did this for the council as well, that I kind of took some of these policies and compared them to data and strategies identified in the Dutchess County Housing Needs Assessment that was completed in 2022. So this is a county-wide study. There are some recommendations for Beacon that we'll get to at the very end, but I think just keep in mind that going through that this data is county-wide, so I think it will be an interesting next step to dive into the data specifically for Beacon to kind of see how that compares to the county. They didn't do that in this study, but I think as we dive into the tools that we'll go through are kind of a more general, they're general points that I think there's additional research that could go into each one of these to kind of target them and how best they would impact housing development in the city of Beacon. But again, this study was just looking at housing patterns and demand across the county. 2022 is 2 years ago now, but as far as data and planning documents go, that's not very old. So they started with kind of noting that we do have slow population growth in the county. It's actually nice that we are seeing growth. There was a while where it was stagnant or declining, so we are seeing slow population growth, but shrinking household sizes, right? So this is, although the population is growing, the shrinking household size is also something that's putting a lot of pressure on housing and housing needs in the county. Large houses that used to house multiple residents and members of a family are now kind of, as you can see, the size of the average household is going down to 2.4 persons per household on average. So that's just kind of less people in each housing unit means there's a higher demand for more units. Aging population as well, which this comes into housing in terms of thinking what type of housing we're trying to build, where, and maybe what kind of accessibility needs that housing will demand. So we are seeing an aging population in Dutchess County, as you can see here, kind of significant in the 55 and older with decreases. I would suspect that this will be a little bit different for Beacon, again, if we were to dive into the specific Beacon data here, but again, this is county-wide. The supply has grown in terms of housing, but it remains dominated by single-family homes and single-family districts around the county. We'll get into this specifically for Beacon as well, but nearly 70% of the housing stock in the county is single-family homes, and this has been pretty steady over the past decade.
So, sorry, the green is single-family homes?
The green on the top, the green is single-family homes, the green is owners, and the pink is renters, and then when you get to the right side, this table, the top, that 69, that larger portion is the single-family homes. And you can see that this is kind of being maintained in new construction as well, which is the far right bar. So historically, we've been single-family homes, but we are continuing that pattern as well. In development. So
it just means the market's responding to any, or at least expressed need, without necessarily taking into consideration what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful.
And then this is kind of getting into the affordability component. The county-wide study did find that incomes have lagged behind housing costs. I think this is kind of a national conversation, talking about if you're looking at the left chart, right, the green color is talking about homeowners, And you'll see that the home values have increased over the past decade by over 80%, like the value of homes, whereas the incomes have only increased by less than 60%. That difference is even more drastic for renters, where the cost of rental housing has increased by over 70%, where most renter incomes have increased by less than 40%. So the cost of housing is getting more expensive, but the incomes to pay for that are not keeping up. And then we're kind of seeing this as well in terms of the median renter affordability, which is the chart on the right. So pink is kind of the median gross rent. This is rent with all utilities and everything included, looking at the housing stock. So that's kind of the median rent that you'll see. And the median affordable rent was calculated looking at the median kind of income and looking at renter income, and then looking at affordability, meaning that a unit doesn't cost more than 30% of your income. That number has now dipped down below what the median rent is, right? So the average number of units are more expensive than many of these households can afford at an affordable rate. And then this was a really interesting piece of the study. They really zeroed in on where is the housing lacking in terms of where is it not matching up between incomes and rental costs or purchase prices, right? And what they found was where we're specifically lacking units is at the very highest incomes and at the very lowest incomes, which is actually putting a lot of pressure on that median range housing in terms of that kind of 80 to 120% AMI. That we're seeing a lot of production of those units and even maybe an oversupply of those units, but we have higher income households kind of buying down and lower income households trying to buy up or rent up, just because that's where the housing is. So we'll come into kind of the recommendations at the end, but they specifically tried to target, especially this lower end of income ranges, target that with affordable housing. And then again, this is kind of getting into that cost burdens have risen, especially for renters. So I think if you want to look at the most recent numbers, it's the far pink band for each of these bar charts is the number of cost burden renters, and at every income level except for the 20 to 34,000. This has increased, right? The number of renters who are cost burdened by the amount they're paying for their housing. So it is kind of hitting, I think the important thing here is it's hitting all income bands in terms of this kind of cost of housing just jumping out a little bit far beyond what your income can support. So then the study went into recommendations. Like I said, they did identify a need to target renters who are earning less than that $50,000 in terms of income. So what you're doing in terms of AMI bands or units that reach those income levels was identified as a goal. They also kind of set up, it's almost like a game plan for 20 years. They kind of identified, based on our undersupply of housing, how many units would we need to kind of try to dig ourselves out of this? And they identified a number just over 2,000. And then they split that up by fair share across the county. And when they were looking at each city, municipality, or county or region's area for kind of fair share, they looked at what's the total distribution of households, how many households are making under 50,000, and kind of the location of jobs. And then so this is how they kind of broke it up. And this is interventions. I think we could have a whole session talking about how they kind of define interventions, but it's kind of, you can think about it as units or bundles of units, and they kind of broke this up by average number of interventions per year that each area would need to make in order to kind of make the total number of interventions over 20 years. So you can see that Beacons is pretty low, right? They identified 5 interventions a year for the next 20 years to get 105 interventions in the community. This may be, I'd have to dig into this number a little bit. I think the reason that number is so low is we're going to get into the number of measures the city has done to include affordable housing in all new developments. So that's probably in terms of the percentage. But also they base it on the number of households that are making less than 50,000. And I think by looking at the last comp plan information, that a significant portion of the population is making much more than that. And so that kind of fair share, that got that distribution wasn't necessarily here.
Sorry, this was done in 2020, right?
2022.
2022, okay.
Yeah,
So,
I think when they started working on it, the 2020 census data hadn't come out, so they were using 2019 as the most recent data.
okay, so, yeah, all this stuff tends to kind of lag, right?
Yeah.
Between the data, the reporting, and then the response.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But what I'm curious about is as of 2022, and this is county data collected, right?
They use U.S. Census data.
This is census data.
Yeah, a lot of it's U.S. Census data,
Yeah, okay.
with some probably county using the rental housing survey and
Right.
things like that.
What I'm curious about is whether, for example, for Beacon, it's taken into account, as you say, the interventions that have been part of applications, but
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily built. Meaning?
Yeah, did they count the development pipeline
Yeah.
and start counting units that hadn't been built? Especially because I think many communities saw between 2020 and today, we've seen a lot of approvals that haven't actually gotten built.
Yeah.
It's kind of starting around 2021 when the interest rates and everything really started to skyrocket in construction. So I would have to look into the data
Yeah.
to see if they counted
Just curious.
pipeline. People often do. They
Yeah.
count approved units.
Yeah.
So.
Because that would do two things. It would speak to whether or not Beacon is kind of keeping pace
Mm-hmm.
with the recommendations outside of the fact that these are recommended, meaning
Yeah.
on their own, right? On our own.
Well, I can say, so the city was, Bruce helped me with this data. The city recently applied for the pro-housing community certification program under New York State. So this is, New York State kind of put out the certification program earlier this year. If you could demonstrate that you were seeing a growth in housing, they weren't specifically looking at affordable housing, they were looking at housing in general. If you could show 3% growth over the last 3 years and 1% growth over the last year, you were certified as a pro-housing community. Meaning you had like zoning mechanisms in place and building permits going out that were building kind of the necessary number of housing. And City of Beacon, I think we were over 1% and 3% in both of those categories by just a little bit.
So just by that metric alone, it may speak to the fact that we are
We are
keeping pace
keeping- yeah.
with the recommendation.
Yeah.
What does that pro-housing status
Get you?
get you?
It gets you higher ratings in any grant applications, both private developers and the municipality. If you're applying for anything for funding from the state, they're gonna give you extra points if you're a pro-housing community.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
So especially for a lot of the private developers who may be applying for Mid-Hudson Momentum Fund or CFA, the Consolidated Funding Application, the city having that is gonna help them be able to kind of get any of those housing program financing.
That's good, and
Yeah.
that helps incentivize developers.
It helps them to be
knowing
able
that
to
we have
include
that
the affordable
status.
housing. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, that's good,
Yeah.
because even though we're keeping pace, it doesn't mean we can't exceed.
Yeah,
And
and again,
should,
like keeping pace with this
probably.
number, I think what I was trying to get at earlier is this, I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to try and maybe shoot a little bit higher than this as well, just because there may be in Beacon, I'd have to dig into the data more, a need to kind of build back that workforce housing that was
Yep.
maybe lost in the earlier years of the revitalization, when you didn't have the inclusionary housing policies and tools that you're using now.
Yeah, whether you call it workforce housing, really what it comes down to is just the ability for people of lesser means, and especially the aging population, which
Yeah.
is important, because as we saw
Because
by
we
your
are
first,
yeah.
we're aging,
Yeah.
and not just Beacon, but as a whole.
Yeah,
And there are real stresses on the aging population, and
Absolutely.
not only affordability, but access to healthcare.
yeah, and then just seclusion and being able to be in an
Right.
environment that you can easily walk to, and so that gets into a lot of we're constantly talking about walkability and
Yeah.
accessibility.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now getting into, so then they did kind of give a toolkit, the report did, and what we're gonna kind of focus on and what I focused on with the council at the request was looking specifically kind of into this first one, this local site identification and land use updates for new construction, so kind of focusing on the zoning. But housing is a very intricate kind of puzzle in terms of trying to solve this affordability, so I don't want to make it sound like zoning is the only tool that you need to combat this. There's a number of other kind of rehabilitation and especially right now financing that is needed to actually get this housing built. But since this board kind of focuses most on zoning and how that impacts, we wanted to keep it to that. So as we've kind of been talking, the City of Beacon has already kind of implemented a number of tools that are in that best practice list of affordable housing tools. You guys have had accessory apartments, ADUs on the books for a number of years, way before many other communities in Dutchess County. Regulation of short-term rentals, permitting multifamily in all commercial districts. There's been a number of cases of facilitating affordable housing development on city-owned lots, right? Putting those out for requests for proposals. You do have an inclusionary zoning policy that requires workforce units for every new development without any give back, which is pretty unusual and pretty pretty forward for most communities in Dutchess County. And then also what we're talking about right now is that in front of the council, in front of this board, the elimination of parking minimums is also kind of seen as one of those best practice tools. So those are the things the community has already done or is already talking about. And then what I want to go through is additional zoning tools that I kind of presented to the council that they're thinking about moving forward. Not all of these, right? This was kind of the list. Some of these, like I said at the top, require more research into the actual numbers to see, is this an appropriate tool for the City of Beacon and how should this tool be implemented? But so one of them is, going back to that first slide, talking about how 70% of the housing supply in Dutchess County is single-family homes, right? And eventually you're just not going to have enough space to keep building single-family homes there. And this is one of the best practices in kind of smart growth development, is in areas that are served by municipal water and sewer and services, looking to densify in gentle ways, not always massive multifamily, but how can you add softer density? So one of those is, looking at, this map is highlighting the number of R1 districts kind of throughout the city. So looking at these R1 districts and thinking about which portions of these or areas could maybe two-family homes be permitted in addition to single-family homes. Or alternatively, maybe kind of updating this map where some of these R1 districts become higher density districts that do allow two-family, three-family, or multifamily. And this is kind of what has happened around the center, the Main Street core, with the transition zone, with the transition district. So there could be more work into either of those to look at how the zoning could be tweaked to incentivize just the land area in the City of Beacon that could be used for slightly higher density.
Sorry, am I right that on that map, on the upper right, that's 52 going out of town, right?
Yeah, so that's Fishkill Avenue 52 that kind of runs out. So that's where you see a lot of where we've had a lot of the GB districts, right? Along Fishkill.
Yeah, so just asking relative to that particular focus by the committee and how this particular conversation plays back into that conversation, right? What they're talking about on the committee.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's a lot of conversations about housing and zoning going on at the same time right now. So it's, I think Fishkill's looking at this. The Fishkill Avenue Committee is looking at this one corridor where there is a subcommittee focused specifically on zoning. And then we have the council looking, obviously, citywide.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think as long as they're sort of, as it relates to the Fishkill corridor, this conversation that the city's having, that they're speaking to one another.
Yeah.
I'm sure they are.
Yeah, good thing I'm sitting on all the committees and boards.
I think, and there are some good examples of the smaller multifamily that have really been knit into the residential community that exist either, I think it's on Chestnut or Eliza on the north side of Main Street, where the scale, is not overwhelming at all to the...
And oftentimes you can do this by going and looking at the existing urban form, right? Where there are a few places where there is an existing two-family in an R1 district that was there historically, that if it burns down or whatever, cannot be built back. So many times when you're first looking at this tool, if we were to dig into one of these, if the council wanted to dig into these, my recommendation would be to go and look at the actual land use and see where you are seeing two families already, right? And those would be the areas you would focus on because it's already a part of that fabric of that neighborhood. And you would look to see if it's an appropriate tool there. That's where you would start. So then there's also, which again, I think there's been a lot of work around this already in the city of Beacon, but there's always room to improve of looking at increasing development potential kind of near transportation, which in this case, the train station. And so obviously Linkage District and the waterfront districts do have tools already for that. But there is an area to look at. Could you incentivize more affordable housing in these areas? Could you allow greater densities somehow and tweak those? Because again, for that mobility aspect of both kind of all households, but also senior households in terms of being close to public transit is a huge benefit.
So when you talk about greater densities, for some reason my mind immediately goes to developers seeing dollars, right? Because that's always the struggle sometimes, right? You have developer looking to, for the sake of return, max out density, however possible. And it leads to some pretty awful applications.
Yeah, right? It can, but you can also see in areas where, and I don't know, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily any of these districts, and maybe not in the city of Beacon, but where if densities aren't high enough and the cost of development is at a certain point, you'll see less development there just because you need a certain kind of
That's
economy.
Understood. There's
so I think it's on both sides, but like I think
ROI.
absolutely there does need to be controls to make sure it's not just, some people would argue different if they have a totally free market approach to something, right? But I think,
fair.
yeah.
And of course, developers are people too.
Yeah. Well, I try and approach it as we need the developers to build affordable housing, right?
So that's
municipalities are no longer building affordable housing.
Yeah.
The state is not building affordable housing.
So that's
you do
why
have
I
some
asked.
nonprofits, but few and
Right.
far between, not enough. And so if we want to get ourselves out of this hole, the developer needs to be the partner in this.
Agreed. And so for that reason, how do you incentivize good developers toward that balance, right?
Yeah.
Because of course they need to see a return. They need
Yeah.
to see, the fact that they're committing capital.
Yeah.
See,
Yeah,
but
and
then when you
but-
talk about it in context of affordable housing, of course, so a lot of the applications that we've seen recently with developers is a mix, right? Because
Yeah.
you talked about that
Yeah.
imposed requirement.
Yeah, because we
And
require
that
it, yeah.
doesn't appear to be burdensome. But, the question is that enough?
Mm-hmm.
Is that meeting the need in terms of the income levels, right?
Yeah.
And then how best to make sure that right balance is struck going forward for good development, right?
Mm-hmm.
With developers that we know do reasonably good
Yeah.
work, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to have to balance that, right? Like defining what good development is. And then unfortunately, a lot of this comes down to anything's possible, right? If you can get all the grants, if you're savvy with all the grant writing and you know how to tap into the LIHTC program and you know how to tap into the Mid-Hudson Momentum Fund, then yeah, you could feasibly build anything, right? If you can get that funding. Or some development companies maybe just have that equity and they can
Yeah.
do that, and if the market's hot enough, they'll get that return. But it is a whole balancing, I think. as well.
But what you're describing is somewhat relying on the market, relying on the private owner, so,
Yeah.
and I know zoning can't solve every issue.
Oh,
Some
no,
of
yeah.
it is zoning and other legislation.
Yeah, and we'll get
So-
into that because I think that's a point that comes up when we talk about the inclusionary housing policy and whether that could be tweaked. I think that starts to play into this, like the pro
Right.
forma, how does this pencil out? And
Yeah.
there is a lot of research and data that if you put that percentage too high and the market can't sustain that, you will actually decrease the amount of housing being built in your community.
Yeah, you're going
you
to
know?
disincentivize it.
Yeah. I'll try and.
Oh, wow, we're having so much fun.
So other ideas are, making multifamily a permitted use in the RD district. It is a special permit use right now, but if you permitted that more freely, maybe you could potentially see more. And then identifying new kind of larger lots in the city that could be rezoned as RD and allow for multifamily. This is again, just trying to increase the number of districts that do permit multifamily. There is a lot of talk about, in terms of permitting smaller lots or expanding regulations for kind of more compact housing, like townhouse developments. And then, further encouraging, so there's also a lot of work that can always be done of looking back at your zoning and making tweaks, right? Zoning is not meant to be something that's like, you put it in place and it's gonna just work exactly as you thought it was gonna work, and there's
Never
not
does.
gonna be any issues. It doesn't work like that. So even if you do have a policy on the books, there is always room to be looking at the data to see, okay, are we seeing the number of ADUs that we want to be seeing in the community? Is it hard to develop these? Are there things that we could do to make this more feasible? And again, this kind of gets to the aging housing that we do. It's not only meant for that population, but we do see a lot of kind of mother-in-law suites or family living on the same parcel, just with separate spaces. Like this one that was featured in the Highlands Current in Beacon.
Yeah, that guy looks super happy.
What? Yeah.
Yeah.
Look at that. Pretty
He's
cool.
like, this is my house.
And then, again, a little bit outside of zoning, but I think the tool that we talked about with the council was targeting looking for more city-owned parcels that are underutilized that could be developed for affordable housing. And where that would come into zoning is in those areas, right, where the city does have a lot of control, that would be a place where zoning could maybe be tweaked even further to kind of get to the conversation where we have more latitude to play with the rules of making good development, but also making it feasible, because the city gets to choose at what price they sell this land. So I think that is an area where you can include more affordability, and you can make that kind of pencil out and happen.
So there's some of those city-owned would be kind of like a PPP.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think two more. Smaller units, so you don't necessarily have like a minimum unit size in Beacon, except for ADUs and your below market rate units. Those do have minimum sizes for them, and I think those are there intentionally for some protections. But there are some communities that are looking at this tool of maybe regulating residential based on the total square footage of residential rather than the number of units, right? In some of the zoning districts, you do have a total unit count that can be within a building. You could think about that as square footages instead. So developers could break up those units in different ways and make more kind of, what's it called in the micro units is kind of how it's referred to right now in the trending news articles. Or incentives for creating smaller units. So this kind of gets to the shrinking household size that we see a lot, right? Average is, I think it was 2.4. That's being brought down a lot by single occupancy households, right? Like single individuals or maybe two individuals living in a unit that could and would or want to live in smaller units to kind of live downtown. And then always ways of, comes to this board of looking at ways of how do you streamline the approval process for affordable housing to make that and to incentivize that even more, right? Time is also money, factors into the cost of the development of the open housing, development of affordable housing. So are there additional incentives, like if someone's providing a higher percentage of affordable units, do they get some kind of streamlined approval process? Or looking at ways of seeker, right? There's type 2 actions that don't require the full kind of seeker review. You are as a local municipality allowed to create that list for yourself of what is a type 2 action. So you could look at multifamily of a certain size, of a certain number of units, and you could add that to your local list of type 2 actions that doesn't require seeker review. And then again, you looking at the regulations for short-term rentals, which is kind of seen as while short-term rentals do have kind of benefits for the tourism economy, it does put pressure on the housing stock for permanent households, so making sure that the regulations are serving the community well. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. And then I think this is the last one. And then, like I said, there is ways of looking at tweaking the inclusionary zoning policy, whether it's maybe adding benefits, adding an incentive for higher percentages, maybe varying right now I think they hit certain AMI levels, now knowing that the county is trying to target 50,000 households of 50,000 and less. Do we need to tweak that AMI band of where we're targeting and vary it? So there is ways to kind of tweak that policy.
That's gonna
again
be a big,
with the
that's gonna be a
caveat.
big one.
What? Yeah, but again with the caveat that this is probably the trickiest one to work with.
For the balance we were just talking about.
To balance, yeah, exactly what we were talking about. And that's it. You asked me if I was going to take the full 30 minutes, and I went 31.
You did great. And look, by the city's clock, we're still
29.
on time.
Oh, okay, perfect.
So, real clock, we won't pay attention.
Yeah.
we're in here, we'll use that one. But thank you. Super duper interesting. Really, really informative.
Yeah,
Would you be
great.
able to share this with us?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure it's accessible or available somewhere.
Yeah,
but
but I
if you
can
wouldn't
send
mind
you.
just sending it to our email addresses, that'd
Yeah,
be
happy to.
great. Thank you.